In March of 2000, there was a man strapped to a lethal injection gurney inside San Quentin State Prison. And he whispered a single final word. He just said, peace.
Wow.
Yeah. And he was wearing this sacred white feather with black edges draped across his chest. He was claiming to be this highly purified, deeply spiritual man who went by the name Young Elk.
Right, which is quite the contrast.
And a massive contrast, because to the families who were watching him from the other side of that glass, he wasn't a spiritual man at all. He was the monster who had literally crushed their teenagers' skulls with rocks.
Yeah, the guy who threw an 11-year-old child off a 105-foot bridge.
Exactly. So today, we are taking a deep dive into the horrifying evolution, the agonizing 22-year legal labyrinth, and the really highly contested execution of Darrell Keith Rich.
Yeah.
Back in his 1978 reign of terror, he was known as the Hilltop Rapist.
And we are examining a truly massive stack of source material today for this. I mean, we have court records that span over 2 decades.
Its pile is huge.
Yeah. It really is. We've got appellate decisions that went all the way up to the United States Supreme Court, historical archives, and these incredibly detailed psychological profiles.
Like we really need for the mission of this deep dive.
Right, because we want to look beyond just the basic timeline of what happened. We need to explore the psychology of an offender whose violence escalated at, well, an almost unprecedented rate.
It was so fast.
Incredibly fast. And we also need to dissect the highly complex mechanics of the insanity defense and really understand why the American appellate legal system is designed to move so incredibly slowly. I mean, even when guilt is absolutely not in question.
Okay, let's unpack this, because to really understand the decades of legal battles that follow, we have to start by understanding the sheer magnitude of what happened to Cottonwood, California in the summer of 1978.
And setting that scene is so important.
It is, because for context, if you aren't familiar with it, Cottonwood back then was a very small, tight-knit ranching community.
Everybody knew everybody.
Exactly. It's the kind of place that operated on this implicit social contract. People didn't lock their doors, right?
Yeah.
Kids walked to the grocery store entirely alone.
Which is just how things were done then.
Right. But within the span of just a few weeks, from June to August, that implicit trust was completely eradicated. It was just gone.
And the psychological toll on a community like that, it really cannot be overstated. It is akin to a biological contagion entering a closed system.
Oh, that's a good way to put it.
Yeah, because the very first casualty is the illusion of safety. The normal parameters of daily life completely change. And this collective paranoia sets in because, well, the threat is entirely unpredictable.
Nobody knows who's next.
Yeah.
I was looking at the survivor testimonies in the file, and the sheer volume of violence in such a compressed time frame is overwhelming.
It's a lot to process.
It really is. Because before the murders even began, there was this intense string of brutal assaults. There are 5 women listed in the sources who survived his attacks that summer.
Right. Donna W., Robin H., Lisa S., Marla Y., and Kelly M.
Yes, and their ages ranged from just 14 to 25 years old. But what really stood out to me wasn't just the physical violence, it was the incredibly calculated way he operated before the physical violence even started.
His specific methodology.
Exactly. He had a very specific, terrifying modus operandi.
And the methodology of an offender tells us a great deal about their psychological needs. He would pull these young women into his vehicle, and the very first thing he would do was force their heads down between their legs.
So they couldn't see out the windows.
Right. They couldn't identify landmarks or figure out where he was taking them. It is a highly calculated method of sensory deprivation and spatial disorientation.
Just immediately stripping them of any bearings.
Precisely. By eliminating their visual awareness, he instantly isolates them. They lose their grounding in reality, and this severely heightens their fear and immediately increases the dependency on him for survival.
Which establishes absolute psychological dominance from the very first second of the encounter.
Exactly. It's all about control.
And he used constant, terrifying verbal threats to enforce that dominance, too. He didn't just tell them to stay quiet. I mean, he told one victim he had a gun under the seat.
He told another he had a flashlight and would bash her head in if she moved.
Yeah, and the most chilling example was his threat to 15-year-old Kelly M. He told her there was a dead body in his trunk.
Which is just a horrific thing to say to a teenager.
Right. And whether there actually was a body in the trunk at that exact moment almost doesn't matter. The psychological weight of a predator telling a 15-year-old that she is riding in a car with a corpse, That's just paralyzing.
Because those threats serve as an invisible restraint. He is building a mental prison for the victim before he ever inflicts any physical harm.
And if that mental prison failed, if they showed any resistance whatsoever, the physical violence he used to regain compliance was absolute.
The attack on Donna W. in mid-June really illustrates the severity of that violence.
It really does. She's simply walking to a market in Reading. He attacks her from behind, pushes her off the road, and throws her down a steep hill.
And when she refuses his demand for a sexual act, he hurls her to the ground and begins beating her head with a blunt instrument.
The case file state he struck her at least 10 times.
Yeah.
Her head injuries were so catastrophic that she physically couldn't climb back up the hill to get to the road.
She was just trapped down there.
Yeah. She lay at the bottom of that hill for more than 12 hours before a passerby finally spotted her. 12 hours.
And leaving a severely traumatized, bleeding victim at the bottom of a hill for half a day, that requires us to look at the biological reality of that trauma.
Because it's immense.
It is. Blunt force trauma to the head of that magnitude causes severe brain swelling, deep disorientation, and immense blood loss.
It's a miracle she survived.
Truly. But psychologically, the act of leaving her there demonstrates a complete detachment from her humanity. He didn't see her as a person anymore.
Just an object.
Right. He saw her as an object that he had broken and then just discarded.
And that detachment rapidly crossed the threshold from brutal assault to outright murder. Because as the summer progressed, the sources outlined 4 murders that occurred in terrifying succession.
A very rapid escalation.
The first was 19-year-old Annette Edwards in early July. She was walking to a local fireworks show. He snatched her, attempted a sexual assault, and then beat her to death with a rock.
And the autopsy details for her are incredibly grim.
They really are. The blunt force was so extreme that her upper jaw was fractured in 2 places, and those fractures extended deep into the base of her brain.
Using a weapon of opportunity, like a rock, to inflict that level of catastrophic structural damage to the human skull that requires a frenzied, massive exertion of physical energy.
It's not clean or detached.
Not at all. This is not a clinical killing. It is close contact, it's intimate, and it is driven by an overwhelming rage.
Then, in early August, a 17-year-old girl named Patricia Pam Moore vanishes from a motel in Reading. Her nude body is discovered weeks later at the Ego dump.
And the coroner found she had been raped, manually strangled, and her skull was crushed with a 5-inch rock.
So we're seeing similar violence, but layered.
Exactly. We are seeing a layering of lethality. Manual strangulation is one of the most intimate forms of murder. The killer must physically feel the life leave the victim.
You have to sustain that pressure for several minutes.
Right. So to follow that up with catastrophic blunt force trauma with a rock, it suggests a need to completely obliterate the victim long after the threat of resistance is already gone.
And the compounding terror reaches a sickening level with the 3rd murder victim, 26-year-old Linda Slavic.
This one is particularly brutal.
She's kidnapped from a bar in Chico. He drives her to his house in Cottonwood, rapes her there, and then drives her to the Ego dump. And this detail is really hard to even say out loud. He actually shows Linda the decomposing body of Patricia Moore.
He forces her to look at what he has already done.
Yes, and then he shoots Linda twice with a .22 caliber pistol, once in the neck and once directly into her open mouth.
The theatricality of that cruelty is staggering. Showing a captive victim the remains of a previous victim is an extreme assertion of omnipotence.
He's playing God.
He is essentially playing God. He is demonstrating his absolute power over life and death. He is maximizing her psychological suffering, making sure her final moments are spent in unimaginable despair before he executes her.
The final crime in this timeline is the one that truly broke the community. Annette Silix was just 11 years old.
Just child.
A child walking home from the grocery store in Cottonwood. He snatched her off the street, drove her to his house, and subjected her to severe sexual assaults. Then he put her in his car and drove 30 miles out to the Johns Creek Bridge.
And what happens next is just horrific.
He threw an 11-year-old child 105 feet off a bridge to the rocky creek bed below. And the most devastating detail in the entire source file is the autopsy finding. She was alive when she went over the edge.
That is just heartbreaking.
She survived the impact long enough to curl herself into a fetal position on the rocks below.
The physical evidence of her survival, the fetal position, the fact that she actually inhaled her own blood, it speaks to a protracted, agonizing death.
It's unfathomable. But I have to stop you there and ask the question that anyone listening to this is probably screaming at their device right now. How does this happen so fast?
It's a very valid question.
We are talking about a timeline of weeks. How does a human being go from sexual assault to beating someone with a rock to throwing an 11-year-old child off a bridge all in one single summer?
It is an extreme acceleration, but within the psychology of serial predators, it is a recognized phenomenon, and it's centered around boundary testing and the diminishing returns of a psychological payoff.
Okay, break that down for us.
Initially, an offender might seek sexual gratification coupled with the thrill of dominance. But when they successfully commit an assault and evade capture, they experience an adrenaline surge. They get this feeling of invincibility.
But that thrill doesn't last.
No, it fades quickly. To achieve the same psychological high again, the violence must escalate.
It's like building a tolerance to a drug.
Exactly like building a tolerance. Furthermore, the early survivors represent a severe threat to his freedom. I mean, they are witnesses.
So the logical, if completely twisted, next step is to eliminate them.
Right. So the violence escalates to murder, but very quickly, the murder itself becomes the primary compulsion.
He's chasing the murder, not just the cover-up.
Exactly. And the escalation to a child victim signifies the complete erosion of any remaining internal societal inhibitions. The violence just becomes an all-consuming fire that accelerates until it burns completely out of control.
Which makes how he was finally caught so fascinating. Because he wasn't taken down by a brilliant forensic sting. The police didn't find a fingerprint that cracked the case. He was caught entirely by his own ego.
His own worst enemy.
Truly, he possessed a pathological need to boast that directly led to his downfall. Let's look at his alibi because it is almost comically bizarre.
The events leading up to his arrest really provide a masterclass in the vulnerabilities of the criminal ego.
It's mid-August. He goes over to a friend's house and asks if the friend wants to go dirt bike riding. The friend declines. Rich leaves on what the police reports specifically identify as a street bike.
Not a dirt bike, a street bike.
Right. And he is gone for maybe 20 to 30 minutes. He comes back to his friend's house and casually announces, "Hey, I just found a dead body at the ego dump."
Like it's totally normal.
Yeah. He actually takes the friend out to the dump, and they're the ones who call the police. But law enforcement immediately realizes the math doesn't work.
The physical logistics of his story collapse under basic scrutiny right away.
The police point out two glaring issues. First, there are 0 tire tracks in the dirt where he claimed to have been riding his street bike off-road.
Right.
Second, the timeline is physically impossible. He could not have ridden his street bike from his friend's house, navigated the rugged terrain of the dump, discovered a body, and ridden all the way back in the 20-minute window he was gone.
It just couldn't happen. Yet, despite this really poorly constructed lie, he willingly inserts himself into the center of a homicide investigation.
Why do that?
Well, this is a behavioral hallmark of highly narcissistic offenders. They crave proximity to the investigation to feel a sense of superiority over the police. Or they just want to privately revel in the chaos they have created.
But the police initially don't even connect him to the string of rapes and murders. They just think he's an erratic guy who stumbled upon a body and is lying about his timeline for some minor reason.
They didn't see the big picture yet.
No, but they bring him in for an interview because a routine background check reveals he used to work for the mother of the 11-year-old victim, Annette Sellex.
That's the connection that gets him in the chair.
Exactly. And during this routine interview, Detective Brewer simply asks, "Would you be willing to take a polygraph?" And Rich says yes.
His agreement to sit for a polygraph is pure hubris. He genuinely believes his intellect and his ability to lie are superior to physiological science.
Explain how a polygraph actually works in this context. Because he sits down, and the police pivot. They stop asking about his background and start hammering him with questions about the bodies at the ego dump. He fails spectacularly. What is happening to him biologically in that chair?
Right, so a polygraph does not actually detect lies. It detects autonomic arousal.
Like your body's stress response.
Exactly. It measures physiological responses that are controlled by the sympathetic nervous system. That's the body's fight or flight response. When a deceptive person is asked a direct question about a crime they committed, their brain recognizes the threat of being caught.
And they panic.
Yes. This triggers an involuntary release of adrenaline. The machine measures the resulting spikes in heart rate, the increase in blood pressure, changes in respiratory rate, and most importantly, galvanic skin response.
Which is what exactly?
It's the subtle increase in electrical conductivity on the skin caused by sweating. So, a narcissistic offender might think they can control their facial expressions or their tone of voice, but they cannot consciously suppress their sweat glands or their heart muscle when faced with the direct reality of their crimes.
Wow. His biology betrays his ego.
Completely.
The examiner tells Detective Brewer that Rich is exhibiting massive deception. Brewer confronts him. He tells Rich his behavior is highly unusual, and Rich visibly panics. He loses eye contact, starts fidgeting, and finally stands up and says, "I've got something to tell you, but not now."
He's running away.
He literally walks out of the station.
I'm
But
ready.
not before asking for the detective's business card and promising to call him in a few days.
The psychological pressure cooker has reached its absolute limit. His facade is cracking. But instead of fleeing the state or, hiring a lawyer, he seeks an audience to relieve the internal pressure.
He goes straight to his friends. He tracks down a friend named Gail Croxall and complains bitterly about the polygraph, joking that the only question he got right was his own name.
That arrogance again.
Yes, but then he weaves this incredibly elaborate, grandiose narrative. He tells his friends that the Hells Angels motorcycle gang paid him $7,000 to operate as a hitman.
Which is a completely wild story.
He literally acts out the murder of Linda Slavic for them. He mimics her, begging for her life, tells them exactly how he shot her in the head and neck with a .22, and brags that he threw the pistol in the river and hid a .22 rifle at his mother's house.
What's fascinating here is the specific mythology he chooses to invent. I mean, why invent a $7,000 contract with the Hells Angels?
Right, because the reality is he didn't get paid a single cent. It was just horrific, chaotic violence.
Exactly. But the criminal ego often cannot tolerate its own reflection. Deep down, he knows that preying on innocent women and an 11-year-old child makes him a monster in the eyes of his peers.
He doesn't want to be a monster. He wants to be a cool hitman.
Right. By fabricating the hitman narrative, he attempts to reframe himself. He is trying to project the image of a cold, calculating professional operating within a dangerous criminal underworld. He is desperately trying to salvage a twisted sense of masculine status among his friends to rationalize his sadistic actions.
And his compulsion to boast simply will not let him shut up. Because later that very same night, he is hanging out with a different group of friends outside a local liquor store.
He just can't help himself.
No. He complains again about failing the lie detector test, saying the cops are going to arrest him the next day if he doesn't solidify his alibi. And then he looks at his friends and says, "Hey guys, I'll level with you. I snuffed her for $7,000.
The internal pressure to be recognized for his supposed omnipotence completely overwhelms his instinct for self-preservation.
It reminds me of the narrator in Edgar Allan Poe's The Telltale Heart.
Oh, that's a perfect comparison.
Right. The police didn't have to tear up the floorboards to find the evidence. The killer ripped them up himself because the beating of his own guilt and ego was too loud to ignore.
And thankfully, his friends realized what they were dealing with.
Yes. His friends, to their immense credit, recognized the danger and immediately called the police. That night at 11 p.m., outside the Orlock bar, Darrell Keith Rich is finally taken into custody.
And the moment the handcuffs click, the dam completely breaks.
The confessions are astonishing in their detail. Detective Brewer interrogates him for 2 hours. It is secretly recorded, resulting in a 45-page transcript where Rich details the murders.
He just spells it all out.
He does. At 3:30 in the morning, he actually leads the police to his mother's house to retrieve the murder weapon. And then, because the local jail trustees in Shasta County find out about the 11-year-old victim and threaten to kill him, the police have to secretly transport him 50 miles away to a substation in Bernie for his own safety.
And when he gets to Bernie, his behavior gets even stranger, if you can believe it.
Even locked in a substation, he intends to assert dominance over the administrative process of his incarceration. He sits down with Lieutenant Eoff at the Bernie station. Eoff puts a tape recorder right in front of him, and Rich freely admits to the murders again.
But then he does something so bizarre.
He reaches into his pocket and pulls out a piece of paper. He tells the lieutenant, "I've made a list of everything I'm responsible for." He hands over an itemized, handwritten list of his crimes.
A literal list.
Yes, and he then looks at the lieutenant and says, "If you would like to have a copy, I can make you a copy of it." He literally offers to walk over to the police station's copy machine to run off duplicates of his own murder list.
Offering to photocopy an itemized list of your own murders is a chilling manifestation of extreme control.
He's acting like he's handing out a resume.
Right, because he can no longer control his victims, and he can no longer control his freedom. So he attempts to exert absolute authority over the clerical reality of his prosecution. He wants to dictate the exact terms of his surrender down to the bullet point.
But wait, if he is literally handing law enforcement a photocopied, itemized list of his murders, leading them to the weapons, and offering up 45-page recorded confessions, how is there even a trial? I mean, what is left for a defense attorney to possibly argue in front of a judge?
It seems impossible, right? But when the factual evidence of guilt is insurmountable, the legal battleground shifts entirely from the act to the mind.
Oh.
The trial becomes exclusively about psychological capacity and the legal definition of sanity.
Which brings us to the deep dive into his background during the trial. The defense team realized their only play was to try and legally define him as a monster created by circumstance and biology, rather than a man making conscious choices.
They had to build a narrative of brokenness.
So they mounted a massive psychological defense calling 44 witnesses. 44. They brought in his mother, his sister, his ex-wife, former girlfriends, teachers, school psychologists, and 6 different medical expert witnesses.
Their goal was to immerse the jury in a comprehensive, generational portrait of a profoundly damaged human being. They were really hoping to elicit enough sympathy to avoid the death penalty.
And the background they uncovered was deeply troubling. He was adopted and raised by a highly domineering mother. He harbored intense resentment toward the other foster children his mother took in. But the most alarming part of the defense's presentation was the documented chronological history of bizarre, escalating violence that began long before the summer of 1978.
It serves as a tragic timeline of severe psychological red flags that were either minimized, ignored, or entirely untreated by the systems around him.
Just look at this progression. At age 17, he gets into an argument with his girlfriend, takes a rifle, goes out into the woods, and intentionally shoots himself in the chest. He survives.
A massive cry for help or a display of deep instability.
Then later, he fires a gun directly over the roof of a police cruiser. He later claims he did it, hoping the officers would return fire and kill him. By age 18, he gets intoxicated and repeatedly uses his mother's car as a battering ram, smashing it into another vehicle.
The aggression is just building.
At 19, he attacks a random stranger with a tire iron. When he hears police sirens approaching, he is so consumed by rage that he punches his bare fist straight through the victim's glass windshield.
You are looking at an individual exhibiting extreme impulsivity, deep-seated self-destructive ideation, and a total inability to regulate profound emotional rage. And all of this is often severely amplified by alcohol consumption.
Based on this extensive history, the 6 expert witnesses for the defense argue that Rich suffered from a psychiatric condition known as intermittent explosive disorder.
Which is a very specific diagnosis.
Right. They argued he also suffered from potential brain damage and a history of severe head trauma. They defined this disorder as a condition where a person is hijacked by sudden, uncontrollable physiological fits of violent rage, which bypass their conscious decision-making and are usually followed by periods of deep remorse.
And to anchor this theory, the defense heavily utilized a specific quote Rich gave to the police during his confession.
He told the detectives, "I should have stopped a long time ago but couldn't."
That single sentence, "I should have stopped but couldn't," is the entire architectural foundation of their insanity plea. They are arguing that his violent actions were entirely involuntary.
Like a reflex he couldn't control.
Exactly. Driven by neurological deficits and explosive psychological compulsions that rendered him basically a passenger in his own body.
But I have to push back on that, and it's clear the jury did too, because they ultimately found him sane. If a person is suffering from a sudden explosion of uncontrollable rage, how are they organized enough to kidnap victims, transport them miles away, meticulously hide bodies at a remote dump, successfully dispose of a murder weapon in a river, and consistently threaten surviving victims with highly specific violence to buy their silence?
It's a huge contradiction.
That doesn't sound like an involuntary explosion. That sounds like calculated, premeditated evasion.
You have just articulated the exact reason why the insanity defense is incredibly difficult to successfully argue in the American legal system. There is a vast, crucial distinction between having a traumatic background or a diagnosable psychiatric illness and meeting the strict legal threshold for insanity.
Explain that threshold, because I think a lot of people assume that if a doctor says you are mentally ill, you can't be held legally responsible.
That is a very common misconception. The legal standard in many jurisdictions is heavily influenced by the Omnitin rule. Yes, Omnitin. It's a legal precedent dating back to the 1840s. The core concept of meninton is cognitive capacity. To be found legally insane, the defense must prove that at the time the crime was committed, the defendant suffered from a mental disease or defect so severe that they either did not understand the nature of what they were doing or they did not know that what they were doing was legally and morally wrong.
So knowing it is wrong is the absolute key.
Precisely. Having intermittent explosive disorder might offer a psychiatric explanation for the initial violent impulse, but as you highlighted, his subsequent actions invalidate the legal defense.
Because covering it up proves you know it's bad.
Exactly. Kidnapping a victim to isolate them, hiding bodies under debris, throwing a gun into a river, every single one of those actions requires a logical, sustained understanding that the act was wrong and required concealment to avoid punishment.
Right.
A truly legally insane person who does not understand their act is wrong doesn't hide the weapon. The jury looked at his calculated evasion and concluded that he possessed the full cognitive capacity to distinguish right from wrong.
And that sanity verdict sets the stage for what is arguably the most agonizing part of this entire story for the families involved. He is convicted in 1980 and formally sentenced to death in early 1981. The trial actually had to be moved out of Shasta County to Yolo County because the local publicity was so intense they couldn't seat an impartial jury.
It was national news at that point.
Right. So the judge hands down the death sentence. But Darrell Keith Rich is not executed until March of 2000. That is a 22-year gap.
And for the general public, and most acutely for the families of the victims, this multi-decade delay is often the most incomprehensible, frustrating, and traumatic aspect of the criminal justice system.
So what does this all mean? We have a man who gave a 45-page recorded confession, led the detectives to his mother's house to get the murder weapon, and literally offered to photocopy his own murder list. Yet the court spent 22 years arguing.
It feels completely counterintuitive.
When you read the specific legal challenges raised in these appeals, it feels like you are stepping into a bureaucratic alternate reality. They aren't arguing about whether he killed those women. They are arguing entirely about microscopic legal procedures.
To understand this, you have to understand the fundamental architecture of the federal appellate system in capital cases. Appellate courts are not trial courts. They do not reweigh the evidence of guilt.
So they aren't looking at the facts of the murders.
Not at all. When the state seeks to permanently extinguish a human life, the appellate courts view their mandate as ensuring that the constitutional process leading to that execution was absolutely flawlessly executed.
Okay, let's look at the first major appeal. The defense argued that the grand jury that indicted Rich was unconstitutional because Native Americans were systematically excluded from the jury pool.
A serious constitutional claim on the surface?
Yes, but the federal court rejected this. They looked at the demographic data and found that the local Native American population in Shasta County at the time was only 2.7%. The court ruled that this low percentage did not meet the threshold for a prima facie case of systematic exclusion. What does prima facie actually mean in this context?
Prima facie translates to at first sight, or on its face. In legal terms, it means the defense must present enough initial evidence to create a presumption that a constitutional violation occurred before the burden shifts to the state to prove otherwise.
Okay.
So the defense argued a violation of the Equal Protection Clause, claiming the jury didn't represent a fair cross-section of the community. But the appellate court ruled that mathematically, a 2.7% population density simply doesn't provide enough statistical evidence on its face to prove that the state was intentionally and systematically excluding them.
The next appeal centered on money. The defense raised an economic conflict of interest argument. They claimed that the public defender assigned to Rich was under severe financial pressure from the funding authorities in Shasta County.
Essentially saying they were too broke to defend him properly.
Right. The argument was that the threat of budget cuts chilled the defense attorney's ability to hire untainted, high-level psychological experts or private investigators to look into the jail conditions. But the appellate court struck this down as well, noting that the defense still managed to call 44 witnesses.
The standard for winning an appeal based on inadequate counsel or resources is incredibly high. You cannot simply prove that the system was financially stressed or flawed.
You have to show it ruined the trial.
Exactly. You must definitively prove that the flaw specifically, directly, and severely worsened the outcome for the client. Because the defense mounted a massive multi-week psychological presentation with dozens of witnesses, the court found no tangible proof of adverse impact.
Now, I have to stop you on this next one, because this is where the public just loses their minds. The defense appealed based on the physical furniture in the courtroom.
Yes, the shackling issue.
During the trial, Rich was shackled at the ankles due to security risks. The defense argued that this violated his constitutional rights by visually prejudicing the jury against him, making him look like a dangerous animal before a verdict was reached.
Which is a valid concern in courtrooms.
But the court's response? They ruled it was not a constitutional error because the trial judge had ordered a skirt, a fabric curtain, to be placed around the defense table. This table skirt completely hid his ankle chains from the jury's view. We are talking about brutal, horrific murders, and the federal courts are spending years debating the drapery in the courtroom.
It sounds absurd when juxtaposed with the savagery of the crimes. It really does. But structurally, the visual presumption of innocence is a cornerstone of constitutional law.
Because if the jury sees chains, they assume guilt.
Exactly. If a jury sees a defendant in chains, they subconsciously assume he is already guilty and dangerous. The appellate court's job is to verify that the trial judge took necessary steps, like installing that table skirt, to protect the psychological neutrality of the jury box, regardless of the defendant's actual guilt.
Finally, there was the appeal regarding the jury deadlock instructions. During the penalty phase, where they decide between life and death, the jury initially couldn't agree. The judge instructed them to continue deliberating.
A standard Allen charge, pushing them to reach a verdict.
Right. And the defense argued that the judge was constitutionally required to tell the jury that if they remained deadlocked, Rich would automatically receive a life sentence. But the appellate court ruled that California state law did not require the judge to inform the jury of the specific legal consequences of a deadlock.
Every single one of these appeals, the census data, the budget constraints, the table skirt, the jury instructions, it all represents the system's exhaustive, microscopic review of procedural due process.
But the human cost of that systemic perfectionism is devastating.
It is an agonizing reality. For the appellate judges, it is a necessary exercise in constitutional rigor. But for the victims' families, it is decades of what one family member accurately described to the press as legalized torture.
Legalized torture. That is heavy.
They are forced to live in a state of suspended animation. Every time a new appeal is filed, they are dragged back into the trauma of 1978. They have to wait 22 years, constantly seeing headlines about the man who destroyed their lives, waiting for the system to finalize a sentence that was handed down when Jimmy Carter was in the White House.
Which brings us to the final, incredibly polarized reality of this deep dive. Because the Darrell Keith Rich that arrived on death row in 1981 is not the man who walked into the execution chamber in the year 2000.
The profound transformation he undergoes in prison introduces an entirely new layer of ethical and social complexity to the final hours of his life.
While incarcerated on death row, Rich discovers or fully embraces the fact that he is one-quarter Cherokee. He legally and spiritually adopts the name Young Elk. His defense team, along with numerous anti-death penalty advocates, argue that this cultural discovery fundamentally reformed his character.
They presented a completely different person.
They did. They paint a picture of a man who spent nearly 2 decades as a model inmate. They argue that the violent, impulsive 23-year-old was gone, completely replaced by a peaceful, deeply spiritual man.
And this narrative of rehabilitation through spiritual awakening is a powerful one. It challenges the fundamental premise of the death penalty. It raises the question of whether society is executing the man who committed the crimes or a completely reformed individual who happens to inhabit the same body.
And this spiritual transformation becomes the center of a massive 11th-hour legal battle that goes all the way to the Supreme Court. In his final days, Rich files emergency appeals demanding the right to participate in an American Indian sweat lodge ceremony on the grounds of San Quentin.
A massive logistical request for a prison.
He argued that this intense ceremony was an absolute religious necessity to spiritually purify him so that his soul could successfully pass over to the spirit world after his execution.
The clash here between First Amendment religious rights and the rigid institutional security of a maximum security prison reaches a boiling point.
The prison administration flat out denies the request. They argue that a traditional sweat lodge requires building an enclosed structure, bringing in large rocks, heating them to extreme temperatures, and using shovels to move them.
Which, in a prison environment, is a nightmare.
Right. They argue that providing a condemned serial killer hours away from execution with boiling rocks and shovels poses a massive, unacceptable security risk to the guards in the facility. But the state takes it a step further to dismantle his legal argument.
What do?
They actually obtain and file an official affidavit from a policy analyst representing the Cherokee Nation. This analyst states on the legal record that the sweat lodge ceremony is not even a traditional practice of the Cherokee people. The state's attorney general publicly calls the entire demand a calculated ruse designed simply to delay the execution clock.
You are looking at two completely opposed interpretations of his actions here. On one side, advocates see a profound, tragic denial of a condemned man's final religious rights by an oppressive state machine.
And on the other side,
On the other side, the state and the victim's family see a highly manipulative, calculated legal maneuver where a man is leveraging cultural heritage he barely possesses to buy himself a few more hours of life.
the appeals are ultimately rejected by the U.S. Supreme Court. And so on March 15, 2000, the execution proceeds. His final hours are stark and highly ritualized.
He refused the standard last meal, right?
He did. He refuses the traditional last meal. Instead, he opts to fast, consuming only broth, papaya juice, and Gatorade, framing it as an act of spiritual penance and purification. When he is finally walked into San Quentin's infamous apple green death chamber and strapped down to the gurney, he's wearing a 14-inch ritual white feather with black edges draped across his chest.
The environment inside that chamber is designed to be as clinical, sterile, and precise as a surgical operating room.
Here's where it gets really interesting. If we analyze the absolute dichotomy of that moment, explain the biological mechanics of the lethal injection protocol, because the reality of what happens to the body contrasts so heavily with his final word.
The state of California utilized a highly protocolized three-drug sequence at the time. The first drug administered intravenously is sodium thiopental. It's a powerful barbiturate.
Just to put him to sleep.
Right. Its sole purpose is to heavily depress the central nervous system, rendering the inmate completely unconscious and unaware of the subsequent drugs. Once unconsciousness is confirmed, the second drug, pancuronium bromide, is injected.
And what does that do?
This is a paralytic agent. It blocks the acetylcholine receptors at the neuromuscular junction, essentially severing the communication between the brain and the muscles. This paralyzes the diaphragm and the lungs, stopping the inmate's breathing.
Okay.
Finally, a massive dose of potassium chloride is administered. Potassium plays a crucial role in regulating the electrical impulses that cause the heart muscle to contract. A massive influx of potassium chloride completely disrupts this electrical system, causing immediate cardiac arrest.
According to the official witness records, right before the sodium thiopental took effect, his final word was simply peace. You look at the savage, chaotic, intimately violent nature of his crimes, crushing skulls with rocks, shooting a terrified woman in the open mouth, physically throwing an 11-year-old child off a bridge to her death.
It's horrifying.
And you contrast that history with this sterile, highly choreographed medical procedure where a man lies quietly with a white feather, whispering the word peace as his diaphragm is chemically paralyzed. The cognitive dissonance is staggering.
It forces anyone observing this case to synthesize the clash of two very different realities. Inside the chamber, you have the state and the inmate navigating a highly choreographed, almost theatrical conclusion to a violent life.
But outside
the chamber walls, you have a society that is deeply fundamentally divided and a community of families finally trying to close a wound that has bled for 22 years.
we have to look at the reaction outside the prison walls, maintaining an absolutely impartial view of both sides, because the polarization was immense. Outside the gates of San Quentin that night, a massive crowd of about 750 protesters gathered.
That is a huge turnout for an execution.
It was a vast coalition of anti-death penalty advocates and Native American demonstrators. They held a vigil in the dark, praying and drumming furiously into the night, explicitly hoping that Rich could hear the beat of the drums echoing inside the death chamber.
They wanted him to know he wasn't alone.
Yes. They viewed the execution as a senseless, barbaric act of state-sanctioned revenge that lowered society to the exact moral level of the killer it was punishing. They also highlighted a grim historical statistic. Rich was the 11th Native American to be executed in the United States since the reinstatement of the death penalty in 1976.
For the protesters gathered outside, the execution represents a profound moral failure of the state. They view it as an act of institutional violence that willfully ignores a human being's capacity for profound spiritual rehabilitation, while simultaneously perpetuating a long, dark historical legacy of systemic oppression against Native American populations.
But on the exact opposite side of that spectrum, sitting inside the sterile witness room looking through the glass, you have the families of the victims. And their reaction is one of profound, visceral, unapologetic relief.
They had waited so long for this moment.
Christopher Slavic, the son of the woman Rich, forced to look at a dead body before shooting her, attended the execution. He was wearing a black suit and a tie covered in a pattern of white skulls.
Wow. Making a statement.
Definitely. When the coroner pronounced Rich dead, reporters in the room noted that Slavic allowed himself a small, definitive smile. David Tidwell, the stepfather of 11-year-old Annette Seelix, was also there. At a previous parole or appeal hearing years prior, Tidwell had famously said of Rich, "He better pray there's not a life after death. If there is, he better hide."
A totally understandable level of anger.
After the execution was finalized, the family spoke to the press about a 100-pound weight finally being lifted off their shoulders. The 22-year nightmare was over.
For the families who endured decades of trauma and legal delays, the execution is not a philosophical debate. It is the agonizingly delayed fulfillment of basic justice. It represents the definitive physical end to a decades-long psychological torment, allowing them, for the very first time since 1978, to begin the process of unburdened grieving without the specter of the killer hovering over them.
And yet, even in death, there was one final, chilling footnote to this tragedy that almost defies belief. The family of little Annette Seelix made a horrifying discovery regarding his burial arrangements.
Oh, this part is just surreal.
They found out that the Rich family plot, the exact pre-purchased place where Darrell Keith Rich was legally scheduled to be buried next to his mother, was located in a cottonwood cemetery just 100 feet away from Annette Seelix's grave.
Just unbelievable.
To his credit, when prison officials informed Rich of this conflict before his execution, he immediately agreed to be buried elsewhere out of respect for the family. But the fact that the man who threw her off a bridge was almost buried a stone's throw from her resting place is staggering.
It is a dark, incredibly poignant reminder of how deeply and permanently intertwined the lives of the perpetrator and the victims were in the geography of that small ranching community.
It truly is. And it brings us to the end of what has been an incredibly heavy, dense journey. We have covered an immense amount of ground today.
You really have.
We started in that terrifying summer of 1978, exploring the biology of trauma and the rapid, terrifying escalation of a predator who tested his boundaries until he consumed a town. We dissected the psychology of a killer whose sheer arrogance and need to boast overrode his instinct for survival, leading him to offer up photocopies of his own confessions.
We navigated a 22-year legal maze, unpacking the constitutional mechanics of the insanity defense and federal appeals.
And we ended in the sterile death chamber at San Quentin, witnessing a profoundly polarized conclusion to a horrific saga.
This case serves as a profound, comprehensive exploration of how a brief, concentrated period of intense violence can necessitate decades of complex legal, constitutional, and emotional processing by an entire society.
The ripple effects truly are permanent. A single summer altered the DNA of Northern California forever, and it exposed the complex, slow, and often agonizing machinery of a justice system trying to process raw, incomprehensible human evil.
So true.
And as we wrap up, I want to leave you with a provocative thought, something to mull over on your own time. You look at the massive span of this story, from the violent, impulsive 23-year-old in 1978 to the 45-year-old man executed in 2000. Over those 22 years, confined in a cell on death row, did the state actually execute the same man who committed those crimes?
Did Darrell Keith Rich truly experience a profound cellular spiritual transformation into the peaceful young elk seeking cosmic purification?
Or, knowing what we know about his history, his profound need for absolute control, his arrogance in the polygraph room, and his documented ability to weave grandiose narratives to his friends, well, was the adoption of this serene spiritual persona simply his final masterful manipulation?
Was it the ultimate exertion of power by a man who, right up to the exact moment the paralyzing drugs entered his veins, desperately needed to dictate and control the narrative of his own life and death?
That is the enduring, unanswerable question that this case leaves behind. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive. Stay curious and take care of yourselves.